I feel so bad for him. Okay.
Who's coming down?
Bruchi. Julian. Let's get started. Screen is not set up good. We'll visit the later. So today is Dav Dalit.
Yeah? Real call the shop. It's bottom line.
Street consultant, this be rapid. No, I'm saying street consultant, it's impossible. I think you might get stuck. I mean, I can leave. He can. Where's it gonna go? Yeah, yeah. More than one time. Yeah.
Okay, Zakta Gemara. We are up to the 2 dots. So yesterday we ended off on a brisker note that Rav Ashi doesn't hold of anybody. Side not of Rav Ashi's teretz, side not of Rava's teretz, side not of Rabbo's teretz. But just to review very, very quickly, we had a steer in Reb Shimon. One Reb Shimon said that Menachos Shelo Lishma apostle. One said Menachos Shelo Lishma are kosher. The first teretz was Rabbo's teretz. It all depends on what the Shaloi Lishma was. If it was Shaloi Lishma of the wrong Bailim, then it would be possible. But if it was Shaloi Lishma of the wrong type of Mincha, it will be kosher. Why? Because a Machshava Shaloi Lishma that's so off the charts, that's so contradicted by reality, doesn't even take on the validity of a Machshava. That was Rabbah. Everybody else argued a Rabbah, and don't forget it. Such a bad Machshava should be worse than a subtle Machshava of Shaloi Lishma. And because of that, Rabbah said that there's a special Gzeres HaKosov, Zois Toras HaMincha, which makes all Menachos good, even if it's Shaloi Lishma. Then there was a challenge, what about Zois Toras HaChatos? And there were 2 opinions. Could be, according to Reb Shimon, the way Reb understood it, by a Chatos, if you did a Chatos Chaylev, L'Shem Chatos Dam, it would also not be a problem for Shaloi Lishma. And then we had the third teretz of Rav Ashi, who said, Rav Ashi's teretz was, that was the only one that fit in with our Mishnah, and that was, the difference is, if you said that the Mincha should be Shaloi Lishma, then it's going to be possible. When Reb Shimon said the Shaloi Lishma is not a problem, is if he just said the Keli Shaloi Lishma. The Keli is not, it doesn't have an impact on the Mincha itself. Which our Mishnah says that just like a Chatos, it's not only Olu L'Bailim L'Shem Chayva, but it's in Ganzen Puzzle because it's like a Chatos. Zogt Gemara, Bishlama Minchas Chayta, Chatos Kari Rachmana. The Torah refers to it as a Chatos because it says La Yosim Aleh Hashemen, V'Lo Yitin Aleh Levayna, Ki Chatosi. So yeah, it's a Chatos, and the Chatos Shaloi Lishma we know is possible. Ela Minchas Kanois, that's just a Mincha to be boidik the lady who's a Saita. It's not to be Mechaper on the Chet. Minala. So how do you know that Shaloi Lishma will be Psula? The Tani Tana Kamed Rab Nachman. Minchas Kanois, Moisra Nadava. If you had a Minchas Kanois, so you put aside money for the Minchas Kanois, and there was extra, the halacha is, it goes Nadava. As Rashi says, Hivrish Mois, Leminchas Saita, Vahavu Hamois Yosim Nasayrim, and it turns out you set aside more money than necessary to buy the Yisairim required for the Mincha. So what do you do with the extra money? Yiplul Nadava. What does that mean? The Hainul Shlish Esrei Shayfrosh Shahayu B'Mikdash. There were 13 pushkas in the base of Mikdash, and anytime they had a scenario where they had the Yiplul Nadava, they would just put the money into those pushkas. When it was a slow news day at the Beis Hamikdash and there was no karbanas, and they would buy kavasim, sheep, to be makar b'zaylis, and have basar l'shem. The basar was placed on the mizbeach. The ha'ayros and the hide l'kahanim will go to kahanim. The karilu nidvas tzibur. That's what was referred to as nidvas tzibur. These oilos. So Zok Gemara, Tanya Tana Kamed Rab Nachman Minchas Kanois Moish Nedava. Amr Lay. So Rab Nachman said Chaper Karmit. You're saying good. Is that good? Why? Because it says in reference to the Minchas Kanois Maskeres Oven Ksivba. Ubechatos, and by the chatos it says ksiv v'oisa nasan lachem losses es avoina eda. So you have a gzer shava from avoin to avoin. Zog to Gemara ma chatos moishon nedava av minchas kanois moishon nedava. Whereby a chatos is moishon nedava. Zog Rashi kedamar b'shili v'lat chatos b'meseches temura zu medrash dorish yahayada akayin kesef asham the kesef chatois. What does that mean? Davar haba mi moiser chatas mi moiser asham, meaning you put money into a fund to buy a chatos, and it turns out that you put more money than necessary. What do you do with the extra money? Habasar l'shem va'aris l'kayhanim. So they do the same thing by the chatos. So that it makes sense that you're saying that a minchas kanois moiser nedava because you learned it from chatos. Ukechatos. There's another similarity between the minchas kanois and the chatos. Ma chatos psula shaloi l'shma, af minchas kanois psula shaloi l'shma. So that is how we know that the minchas kanois is psula shaloi l'shma because of oven from chatos. The problem is, you know where it also uses a lotion of oven? Elamayata osham ye pasol shaloi l'shma, the gomer oven mechatos. We know, at least according to the Tanakama Shita, the first Mishnah in Zavakim says that an Osham Shaloi Lishma is kosher. It's not like a Chatos. So if that's the case, why? Why don't you have the same limit of oven Chatos? The same way you know Minchas Kanois is like a Chatos and Shaloi Lishma is Psula, why don't you have the same limit by Osham? Where does it say oven by Osham? So Rashi says, but oven siv v'lo yada v'oshem v'nasa avoinoi. So it doesn't say oven, it says avoinoi, but close enough. Zok Gemara, no, it's not close enough. Done in avoin me avoin, which will teach us the Minchas Kanois, but if it ain't done in avoinoi me avoin, you cannot learn Osham from Chatos. Frank Gemara, my nafkamina, we know when it comes to Gzer Shava, you don't have to be so accurate. The Gemara actually makes the Brighton, the tongue of actually makes a Gzer Shava from the word Vishava Kohen to the word of Kohen. Because in both cases, we're talking about the same thing. The Kohen who came into the house that had a nega on it, and then a week later he returned to the house. But both of them are describing the same action, going into the house. And even though it's not the same word, we actually make a Gzer Shava. Zui Shiva, Zui Bia. What do we learn from one to the next? Zok Rashi, Mefarish B'Toris Kayanim, Ma Bia, Chaylet, V'Koitze V'Tach, V'Noitzen L'Shavua. Just like when he originally comes to the house, what he has to do is he has to take out the infected bricks and fix up the plaster and put the house back together, and then wait a week to see if the nega will reappear. That's exactly what you do when he comes back the second time to check. He does the same thing again. Even though the words aren't identical, because they're both referring to the same idea. There are other lashonis, but this is it. But I'll call upon him. The fact that it says avoinoi should not be an impediment to learning from chatos that shaloi l'shuma should be psula. V'oid ligmar avoinoi me oven de shmias koil. I actually have a carbon chatos that also uses the word avoinoi. Which carbon chatos? The carbon chatos of an oil of yored when somebody heard edus and he refused to say over the edus. That also talks about a chatos, and there it does say im lo yagid v'nosa avoinoi. If one does not say edus that he saw, he will be over an avera. So now you have a perfect clear shava of avoinoi to avoinoi. And why is it that we don't say that an osham shaloi l'shmas psula? Elo ki garmi gzer shava l'moiser nedavahu degamber. You know what it is? We're never using the gzer shava to learn that shaloi l'shmas psula. Not even by minchas kanois. All we're learning, we're limiting the gzer shava. It's just teaching us the halacha of moiser nedava, which means the moiser nedava goes to Ketz HaMizbeach, and that will be equally applied from Chatos to Asham and from Chatos to Minchas Kanois. But that's off the table, the Shaloi Lishma. Frag the Gemara, how could you say that? When you have a Gzer Shava, you can't pick and choose what halachas you're going to learn and what not. The Gzer Shava is complete. Zok the Gemara, true, but here we have a special pasuk telling us not to use the Gzer Shava across the board. Because Goli Rachmona Gabechatos, V'shachat Oisa Lechatos, Oisa Lishma Ksher Shaloi Lishma Psula. It's only the Chatos who has this psul of Shaloi Lishma. Aval Kol Kachim, meaning Saida Osham, which has Avoinoi, and Saida Michas Kanois, which has Avoin, Bein Lishmon, Bein Shaloi Lishmon will be Ksher. So Frag the Gemara, so now we're back to square one. How do you know that a Minchas Kanois, Shaloi Lishma will be Psula? El Minchas Choite, Minchas Kanois, the Psul and Shaloi Lishma, Shaloi Lishmon, Minalam. How do you know this halacha? Zok the Gemara. Chatos taimamai. What is the reason why a chatos is partial shaloi lishma? Mishum dichsiv behi. It says chatos he. We had this in Zvachim as well. When it says chatos he, and chatos he tells us that it has to be dafka lishma. Hachanami, so too by the Minchas Kanois, ksiv behu he. It says he. Let's see if our I don't know if the Torah quotes the psukim, but Rashi I believe does. Tichsiva v'chatas nosi chatos he v'loi sheba shaloi l'shmoi, and it says he as well by the Minchas Kanois. So Zok to Gemara. So Asham nami yaksiv behu. It says Asham hu. It says Asham hu by the Asham as well, and therefore why don't you learn that Asham shalosh mas psula? Teretz is where it says chatos he. When we're talking about the Minchas Kanois, where it says chatos he, when we're talking about the carbon chatos, that's during the shchita and zerika stage, which is a critical stage. If you don't do it, the whole carbon is possible. There we will learn that shaloi l'shma will be possible. But you know where it says Asham hu? Who, that who, it's not like before Ma'ariv, Motzei Shabbos, who, when the ref says who, it's just who, that particular who mentioned by Osham is la'achar haktaris emurim hu dechsev. The pasuk there, when it says Osham hu, is after they were already maktir the emurim. Let's see if we have the pasuk here. No, it doesn't quote the pasuk, but where it mentions the hu by Asham is after the Torah. Rashi says the Parshas Tzavas Haaron. It says the Hikter Oisam Akoyin Amizbecha. So we're already talking post Haktorah. Ishay Lashem Asham hu. When you're talking about the Haktorah, there you can't learn any psul of Shaloi L'Shma. You know why? Because Keditanya Aval Asham Loi Nemer by hu Elo La'acher Haktorah Seimurim. And who atzmon shaloi huktu emur of kosher. Even if you weren't makter the emurim, if you bring the carbon, you make the zrika, you already have your kapara. Even if the emurim become possible and you're not makter them, it's still a kosher carbon. So for sure, shaloi l'shma wouldn't possible an avodah that you don't even need to do in the first place. So therefore, by Osham you don't have the limit of shaloi l'shma psula, but the who that it says by the Minchas Kanois and the who that it says by the Chatos, that's talking about the critical avodas, and there, of course, we will learn that Shaloi L'Shmas Psulim. For Gemara, so what does the Torah try to teach us when it says Asham hu? Ve'lahu lamali. What do you learn from the who of Asham? So what did he say? We had this halacha recently. Asham shanitek l're'iyah. What would cause an Asham to be nitek l're'iyah if it had one of the 5 conditions that would be chatois hamesos? Vlad Asham, Temuras Asham, Nischapru Baila, over Shnosa, and let's talk about the Simna. It's Temuras Asham, Meis Baila, Nischapru Baila, and over Shnosa. So what's the Sim of Isim of Vlad. There's Vlad as well. So those 5 conditions say that what do you do with this Osham? What you do is the Bezdin paskins on it. This now is no longer going to be an active Osham. This now is Nidik L'Re'iyah. They put it out to graze. They wait till it gets a mum. Then they sell the animal. And with the money, they buy a Oila, an Oilos Nedava. So, what if it was Nitik L'Re'iyah, and instead of putting it out to graze, they took the actual Osham and shechted it? The loch is kosher l'shem oila. It will be kosher l'shem oila. Even though that's not what you were supposed to do, you're supposed to let it get a mum, but you shechted it. Once Bezdin already paskin, this is l're'iyah, it was nitik from Osham. They cut it off from its Osham, and it is open to becoming an oila b'di'evet. But nitek in or nitek loy. What if you had an Osham with the condition meis by leha, but Bezdin didn't paskin on it yet, and then you shechted it l'shem oila? That would not be kosher. Only if Bezdin paskind, it's ois Osham, now you're going to put it l're'iyah. So that's what we learned from Oshamu. It remains an Osham, even though the actions that had to have occurred, or the incident that had to have occurred, happened already. It was already maced by Leah, but since Bezdin didn't paskin on it yet, that it's nitik l're'iyah, it still retains its status as an Osham, and if it was shechlet stam, it would be possible. Okay, Zok the next to Gemara. Amara. It's very funny. As I was reading this Gemara, someone called me to ask me if I'm makbid on Yosham. And I didn't chap that it's mamish the Gemara we're learning, because the Minchas Omer is what is matir the Osham. So Amarav, Minchas Omer, she comes to Shalolishim. So what is the Minchas Omer? On the first day of Chalamoid, which for us is the second day of Pesach, so on the second day of Yom Tov, which is Tes Zayin Nisan, on that day they would bring a carbon omer, and up until that point you were not allowed to eat any of the wheat that grew in the winter. But once the carbon omer was brought, now all the wheat that was planted in the winter, that grew in the winter, is now mutter to be eaten. That's where the Isra Chadash is. The new wheat you're not allowed to eat, but once you mak of the carbon omer, then the new wheat you're allowed to eat. It's mutter, it becomes mutter. Now, there's an interesting discussion about this carbon omer and how it works. So in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, and I'm going to tell you the pashtus, the Gemara is going to offer a different version, but the pashtus is at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, as soon as the carbon omer was brought, it became mutter. It became mutter. If it was 11 o'clock in the morning, it was 2 in the afternoon, whenever the omer was brought, the chadash was mutter. But when there's no omer, for instance, there's no Beis HaMikdash or Chama L'Tzlan, so then the halach is midaraisa that the moment the morning of the 16th arrives, chadash is automatically mutter. Yet, Rabbi Yochanan made a gzeira that we shouldn't eat chadash until the end of the day. Why? Because Bez Hashem Mashiach will come, and people are still going to remember that first thing in the morning you're allowed to eat the chadash, but then you have to wait for the carbon. So therefore, he said, Yoy Manaf Kulei Aser, the day of the Omer, it'll be Aser a whole day. Why? Hayol Uvasa. So why is it Psula Shalai L'Shema? The reason why it's Psula Shalai L'Shema is its whole purpose is to be matir the new wheat. Hayol Uvasa Lahater, V'lo Yitira. And since it was Shalai L'Shema, it was not matir, because we know every carbon that's brought Shalai L'Shema, even if it's a kosher carbon, so a regular carbon that will be a kosher carbon, okay, so that had some purpose. But if the whole purpose of this carbon is only to be matir, and it didn't accomplish its primary goal, therefore it's in ganzen puzzle, because it didn't accomplish its primary goal. Let's see Rashi. Psula mehikter v'shirei ein. So unlike a regular carbon that was brought Shalai L'Shema, even though it's L'Olam B'Alam Shem Chayva, you continue the process, and the Kohanim get the Shishurayim, not a Minchas Omer, because the whole purpose is Lahater Chadash, and it wasn't able to do that. So that is the Chiddush of Rav, that if a carbon doesn't accomplish its primary goal, then it's going to be Pasal and Gans. even though a carbon like this typically would not be possible. Okay, there's Rabbi spoke a whole big shaila. This carbon oimer, it's brought every day on Pesach. Is it considered one of the carbonates of Yom Tov? Is it considered one of the carbonates of Yom Tov? Lamai nafkamina. The halacha is that no matter whose mishmar it is, the week of Yom Tov, on the week of Yom Tov, all the kaihanim have a chelik and all the carbonas, because that's when everyone's up there. The Rambam discusses that the chelik, the minchas oimer gets its shirayim is nechlik to all the kaihanim. He separates it from the rest of the carbonas of Yom Tov. Another thing, we always mention the carbonas of Yom Tov in Musaf, right? We mentioned all the different carbonas that are brought. We never make any mention of the minchas oimer in our davening on Pesach. It seems like it's a coincidence. It happens to be that on that day we're mater the Chodesh, but it's not connected in any way whatsoever to the carbon to the Yom Tov of Pesach. Not a Yom Tov Dika carbon. It's a standalone carbon that happens to coincide with the 16th day. So that's just as an aside. So v'cheinat ha'omer, but it also makes sense in our Gemara as well, because that's all it does. It's not a Yom Tov Dika carbon. It's not any kapar. It's just all it does is it triggers the heter of the Torah. V'cheinat ha'omer ba'asham nazir. The same thing would be with the asham nazir. What does that mean, Dr. Rashi? A nazir tamei brings an asham lahachshir leminyan nazir's tire to allow him to restart the clock. Kedichsiv maybe kevish mishnasir la'asham v'yomim harishonim yipul. So the asham nazir also has a very specific purpose. So even though normally an asham that's brought shaloi l'shma would be ksheira, ela shaloi olu l'baylim shem chayva, not so much this asham nazir, because or the asham mitzayra sheshachlan shalosh mapsulin hoylu voyu lahachshir. Their whole purpose was to be machshir. So the asham nazir is to start the count. Rashi says the asham mitzayra is to allow him to come to the machana, and the shita mugabetza says to allow him to come to the Beis Hamikdash. So the halacha is it's possible hoylu voyu lahachshir v'lo yichshiru. They didn't accomplish what the goal of the carbon was. Zok to Gemara. Tanan we learned kol hamanochos shenikmitzu shaloi lishman ksheros ela shaloi alu lebaylim l'shum chayva chutz miminchas chayte uminchas kanais. Right, that's what our Mishnah says. But freit the Gemara b'Isa, if Rav is correct, listening nami chutz miminchas oimer. Why didn't the Mishnah say that the minchas oimer as well shaloi lishma is psula? If Rav is correct, Zok to Gemara, because Rav learns pshat in the Mishnah that the Tana is not discussing minchas oimer. It's not in the group of karbonos that he's even including in this poll for three reasons. Kikatani ba yachid. The only types of karbonos that the Mishnah is discussing are karbonos that can be brought as a carbon yachid. But ba tzibur loikatani. The minchas oimer is a carbon tzibur that's not in the scope of his discussion. Kikatani ba biglal atzma, a carbon that comes by itself. Ba b'chal zevach, but the carbon oimer, which is merely accompanying another carbon, loikatani, that the Tana is not referring to such a thing either. As Rashi says, ima zevach the minchas oimer ba ima kevesh the chsev asichem b'yom nifchem es oimer. Okay, and kikatani hanach she'ein kavu lehem zman. We're only speaking about carbonos that are not scheduled on a specific day, but the kavulos man, but the carbon oimer, which is on the 16th of Nisan, loikatani. So there's three reasons why this wasn't in the scope. How the Tana picks the scope of carbonos that he's talking about, the Tana has a reason for it. When there was a very big university that did a study on the efficiency of airports, and they came out that the least efficient airport in the entire Western Hemisphere was our airport, Pearson, because of the bribery and the kickbacks and the incompetence, typical Canadian stuff. Yeah, this is a true story. And this happened about 15 years ago. Yeah, when they rebuilt Terminal 1. And what happened is normally before they publish a study, they'll share it with the members of the study to get their feedback on it. And they got the feedback. The feedback was that the GTAA, Pearson, threatened to sue this university if they published the study. So what they did is they published a study. We did a study of all the airports in the Western Hemisphere except for Pearson, and these are our results. So you can pick the scope of what you want to discuss. So here the Tana had a much more compelling reason to narrow his scope, not to include Omer, because it didn't have these three symptoms or features. Zok to Gemara. Yeah, what I'm saying is a true story. Zok to Gemara weiter.
Fix it?
I think it got worse. Pearson, the reason why flying out of Toronto is so expensive versus flying out of any other airport is because they're so inefficient that the airlines have to pay more money to land the plane in Pearson than in any other airport. Because it's so inefficient. That's why LL stopped flying. Going back 30 years ago, LL had to pay $100,000 every time they landed a plane here. But now it's probably 3 times as much. So LL said it doesn't make sense. It's just too expensive. But that's why why is it that if you fly from Buffalo to Florida, it's a fraction of the price than from Toronto? Very simple. Because the Buffalo airport doesn't charge the airlines as much. Right. Because it's run more efficiently. Zok to Gemara weiter. Omar Mar. V'cheina ta'omer b'asham nazir b'asham mitzoyra sheshachton shaloi l'shmon. Now I'm going to get sued because the millions of followers we have here on YouTube are going to. Zok to Gemara weiter. Omar Mar.
Yeah, you don't get the question, man.
Zok to Gemara. Omar Mar. V'cheina ta'omer b'asham nazir b'asham mitzoyra sheshachton shaloi l'shmon. By Asham Nazar, now we're quoting Rav talking. There as well, Psulin Hoyel Uvo Lahakshir V'lo Yichshiru. Now the obvious kasha is going to be every Asham, if it's Lo Olam Shem Chayv, it's not Mechaper. So if it's not Mechaper, then isn't that enough of a reason to pass it? It also didn't accomplish its need. So that's what we're going to be discussing now. Tanan we learned Kol Azvachim Sheshachtin Shaloi L'Shmon. This is the first Mishnah in Menachos Vachim. Ksherin, Ela Shaloi Ola L'Baylam L'Shem Chayva, Chutz Mi Pesach V'Chatos. Right, the Gemara, if Rab is right, that an Asham Mitzayah and an Asham Nazir as well would be possible. The Bisa Lisni Nami Chutz Mi Asham Nazir V'Asham Mitzayah. These words, even though they're true, the Shita takes them out. Zok the Gemara, Akiva and the Ika Asham Gezelos V'Asham Me'ilos. The Lechapara also, since there are other Ashamim, like Asham Gzelos and Asham Ilos, that are only for Kapara, and therefore they will be kosher if they were brought Shaloi L'Shma, Loip Sigalei. The Mishnah didn't want to list up any Ashamas because it could be confusing. Because some Ashamas would be Pasol Shaloi L'Shma, some Ashamas are kosher Shaloi L'Shma. The Tana stayed away from Ashamas that are not clear. So Frektamar, I don't understand. Maishno Asham Nazir, Asham Mitzayra, the Bo Lahakshir, their purpose is to be Machshir, the Nazir, to recount, the Mitzayra, as Rashi says, to bring Karbonis, V'lo Yichshiru, and therefore, since they didn't accomplish their goal, they're now completely puzzled. Hani Nami, the Asham Gzelois, and the Asham Elois, Bo L'Chapara, the purpose of those Karbonis were to be Mechaper for the Avera. But if it's like Olu L'Baylam Shem Chayva, but like Kipru. So Rab, your logic should dictate that every Asham Shaloi L'Shema should be possible because it doesn't affect the Kapara. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, no, Kapara is not nearly as an important consideration as Hechsher. Because Matzino Shechilek HaKosev Bein Mechaprin Uvein Machshirin. You actually see in the Pasuk a distinction between Mechaprim, which if it doesn't accomplish the job, it's not such a big deal, and Machshirin, where if it doesn't accomplish its job, it is a big deal. Why? Because Mechaperin is behu the asula achamisa. A carbon that's Mechaper, we're going to illustrate here in a very interesting way, mind you. We're going to illustrate that a Mechaper you can even bring l'achamisa. So clearly, even though the person is not around, he doesn't need a kapara anymore. You still bring the carbon. So you see that kapara isn't something that its accomplishment is limited to being mechaper the person who it was for. V'haraya, you can bring it after misa, and we're going to give an example shortly. But machshirin, a carbon that's made to be machshir someone to do something, less behu the asul lachamisa. You'll never find a machshirin that you can write lachamisa. Meaning, if it can accomplish what it needs to, you will never ever bring it. That's not. This is going to be very interesting because a woman who's a yeledes has to bring two korbanos. She has to bring an oila and she has to bring a chatos, right? So let me ask you a question. Which of these two korbanos, the oila and the chatos, do you think she's bringing the kapara? The chatos, right? Now Rashi is going to turn it over on its head, and it's going to prove that the oila is for the kapara and the chatos is to be matir. And it is a very interesting Gemara that we all learned. And the Gemara asks, why does a woman who's a yeledes bring a carbon? The Gemara doesn't ask why she brings a carbon chatos. The Gemara just asks why she brings a carbon. It's interesting to note. It's mashma that it's not even talking specifically about the chatos. Maybe it's the oil that's mechaper. And the Gemara answers, because it's impossible during labor and during the pain of birth that she didn't make a neder not to have another child. So that's a shver answer, because why is she bringing a chatos now? She didn't violate a neder. Let her bring it by the next child when she violates her neder, right? So there's a whole discussion about it in the Gemara, how that works. I don't think the Gemara ever resolved 100% the answer. But whatever the case is, Rashi is going to tell us that the oila is here, the chatos is mechaper, and the chatos is not. But let's see. It's not. She died. So she already brought her chatos, and then she passed away. What do you do with the oila? The halach is yaviu yarshin oilasa. So you see that the carbon that was meant to be mechaper her is brought even lachamisa. So you see that even if it's not going to accomplish the kapara because she died already, it's still going to be brought. But on the other hand, oilaso mesa, if she brought her oila and then she died, lo yaviu yarshin chatosa. So you have a raya that the mechaper, if it doesn't accomplish, is no problem. But if the thing that has to be machshir is not going to accomplish, you can't bring it. Now let's see how in the world did the Gemara get this the situation where the chatos is not the mechaper. So Rashi lays out the argument. It's quite simple. So let's see Rashi, lo yaviu yarshin chatosa. Dezu achas mechomish chatois hamesas. Right, chatos shemesu ba'ala is one of the chatois that's mesas. The chatos sheiledes is a machshir. How do I know that's what Rashi? Because the Gemara in Krisos teaches us that. Kidamrino b'Krisos beperek dam shchita mipnei shemachshirasa lechol bekochim. When she brings that chatos, she's now allowed to eat kochim. Now, and that's the Gemara is medayik from the psukim that when she brings her chatos, she can now eat kochim. Umid chatosa lahachshir. Now that we've proven that the chatos is what allows her to eat karbanos, it must be with a process of elimination that the oilasa is lechaper. K'dichsiv b'yaledes echad lechatos ve'echad la'oila. Now this is not so shver. At first it sounds so crazy. How could you say that the oila is mechaper, not the chatos? We know that an oila is mechaper, right? It's mechaper on the nasei. It's mechaper on the lapshanitic nasei, right? We know an oila is a mechaper. Technically, this woman didn't do any avera that's chai for curse, right? So technically, she doesn't really need a chatos for as a regular chatos. So it's logical to say that it's the oil that's mechaper on her level of chet, whichever it was, like the neder made. But the chatos is not going to be a machshir. Alma, what do you see? Mechaperin karvi. Even though she died, you'll bring the mechaper, you'll bring the oila. But machshirin the chatos, if she died, loy karvi. So Hakanami, we can say in our case, Mechaperin b'shaloi lishman will be kosher lahakriv. It's just below alu l'bayil m'shem chayva, below alu. But Machshirin will be psulim lagamri, which justifies why the carbon oimer, why the asham mitzayah, and why the asham nazir is posel and gantin if they don't accomplish the hechsher. There's a massive problem with this point in the Gemara that I didn't have a chance to find a teretz for. You might not be satisfied with my level of engagement to try to find the teretz, but I did make some minimal status. The kasha is very, very simple. Where do we know that a chatos shemesu baileha goes lemisa? The chomish chatois shemesos. It's halacha l'moshe Messinai. The halacha l'moshe Messinai says that it's mesos. That includes even the chatos of yoledes. It's a halacha l'moshe Messinai. We're starting to make chalukim. It depends. It depends here. The halacha l'Moshe Messinai doesn't make that distinction. So how could we on our own make such a distinction and say that certain chatois are going to have a different halacha? And the art scroll doesn't even bring this kasha up, but in the Masif that's brought up, and it said the Brisker Rav talks about it, but he doesn't bring down the teretz, which usually means it's just a long-winded teretz. So I didn't have a chance to look up at the Brisker Rav yesterday, but I did listen to Rabbi Ross Machshir, and he didn't discuss it, although he finished the shir right over here. He didn't finish the Amud, so could be he's going to discuss it in today's Gemara, and it's really boring that I didn't have a chance to listen to it. I only was driving for I was driving for like 40 minutes yesterday, so I was able to get that in. Zok Gemara weiter, but that is what was a very big difficulty in this subject. Zok Gemara weiter. Maskif law Rabbi Yehuda Beredi Rabbi Shimon ben Pasim. Machshir nami mi les behu the asul lachamisa. You're making such a big deal that Machshir never come lachamisa, and that's the basis of your proof as to why, if Machshir don't accomplish its job, they become puzzle. But the problem is what none we learned. Hamafter shmois linazirosei. Now a nazir brings 3 karbanos. He brings an oila achatas and a shlamim. I'm sorry, an oila, an osham, and a shlamim. So he was mafresh money for all 3 karbanos, but he didn't in the pile of money. He didn't say which $100 for this carbon, which for that carbon. He has a pile of money that's going to be designated to be used for all 3 karbanos. The Allah is loy nehenin. You're not allowed to have a no from it. Be abundance also to have a no from that money. But v'loy mayal, if you had a no, you're not going to be moil. Why will you not be moil? Because mipnei sheruyin lovay kulon shlomim. Because one of the karbanos that you bring with this money is a shlomim. Shlomim is kachum kalim. There's no me'ilah on kachum kalim because shlomim is mom and bailim. But what if mace? What if he dies? What if he dies and there was a whack of money that was left over for his karbanos? What do you do with the money? The law is yiplu l'nedava. Again, it all goes to l'nedava. So Rashi l'shoifreis the halachi b'nazir. That's halacha l'Moshe Messinai. V'chein mefarish b'nazir perk misham already nazir b'sham mechaper. So it's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai that even though the money that was left really supposed to cover for the shlamim, the asham, and the oilam, nevertheless the halacha l'Moshe Messinai says it's yiplu l'nedava. But what if it was mefurashim, meaning it's $100 for the asham, it's $100 for the shlamim, and $100 for the oila? What do you do with the money? Zoktabor the mechatos is chat shemesu bala yoylich liyam hamelach. You got to destroy that money, but loy nehenim, you're allowed to have enough from it. But v'loy ma'al, there's no din me'ilah because chat shemesu bala is ois chatos. A carbon you can be moil. This is also bana, but it's not a carbon. Okay, the demei oila. What do you do to demei oila? Yobi ben oila. You could bring an oila with it. And therefore you'll be moil if you have enough of that money because it does have the status of a carbon. And the mei shlomim, yavi b'em shlomim, you'll bring a shlomim. Now a normal shlomim you can eat for 2 days. The shlomim of the nazir you can only eat for 1 day. Therefore, its time to eat will be limited to 1 day. And the nazir has to bring lechem along with his shlomim, but this carbon will not have to be brought with lechem. Frag the Gemara via oila u'shlamim the nazir the machshirin inu the oila and the shlamim of the nazir are machshirin. They're machshirim him to be able to restart or to end his naziris. What is it talking about? All right, so we're talking about a nazir tahir over here. We're talking about a nazir tahir. The ka'asi la'achamisa, and we're saying that you bring these karbanos even la'achamisa. How could you bring these karbanos la'achamisa? They're machshirin. Amar Papa Hachik Amar Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Lo Motzinu Hechsher Kavua the Bola Achamisa. You don't find a carbon which this carbon is the only carbon designated to accomplish this situation that you bring lachamisa. But the nazir it's Hechsher Shein Kavuhu. The carbon of a nazir is a Hechsher Shein Kavuhu because any one of the carbonos does the trick. It doesn't have to be dafka one. The oimer, the only thing that's going to be matir, the chadash is the oimer. It's not like a multiple choice selection of different karbonos. But the nazir brings 3 karbonos, and even one of them will be matir. Damamar gilach it's very light. Gilach alechem b'shloshton yotza. Okay, let's just learn one more line because we're slugging up Rav. Meisvei asher mitzor shenishchat shaloi l'shmoi oy shaloi nitei midami al gabe b'hoines hareza oila l'gabe b'zbeich v'ton nesachim v'tzarich ashem acher l'achshiroi. So you see clearly that the Hasham mitzora that was shekhet shaloi l'shmoi is kosher. It's a price that's black and white. Keneged Rav, Tufta the Rav Tufta. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be Mamshuk tomorrow.